Hi, welcome to Olicana Music. My name is Alistair. This week I'm demystifying the CAGED system. It's not very complicated, but it seems to trip a lot of students up just because you can do so much with it. In this lesson, I'm going to show you what the CAGED system is, how to use it, and how to apply it to any chord, scale, or arpeggio that you can think of. If you feel that you can't play across the whole fretboard, that areas of the fretboard are alien to you, that you're stuck in scale boxes, or that your chord vocabulary is limited, the CAGED system can solve all of these problems. Stick around to the end because I'm going to show you a really simple exercise that you can use to start understanding the CAGED system with. With all that out of the way, let's go on with the lesson. What is the CAGED system? The CAGED system is a way of mapping out the guitar's fretboard. You can use it to map chords, arpeggios, scales, any sort of pattern of sound that you can imagine. It's not something that people have just made up. It's a coincidence of the way the guitar is tuned and therefore the way that notes actually lay themselves out on the fretboard. You can think of it as a little bit like a map. A map describes the layout of an environment. So a map of your city describes the layout of your city so that you can navigate it more easily. Similarly, the CAGED system is a map of the guitar's fretboard. It shows you how the guitar's fretboard is laid out so that you can then navigate it easily and more efficiently. The guitar is a heavily shaped-based instrument. There are 5 shapes that you already probably know that are centered around your open chords. So for example, there's a C chord, that's a C shape. There's an A chord, that's an A shape. There's a G chord, that's a G shape. There's an E chord, that's an E shape. And there's a D chord, that's a D shape. C, A, G, E, and D, 5 open chords, 5 shapes that take their name from the open chord. Knowing those 5 chords is great, you can play loads of songs with them, but wouldn't it be awesome if you could play a C chord anywhere on the guitar's neck, for example up here? The CAGED system is what will let you do that. If you can play a bar chord, hopefully you understand that you can take an open chord shape like E and move it around the fretboard by using a bar. So I could put a bar on and then my E shape in front of it, and I can move that E shape anywhere on the guitar, and it'll always sound really good. Playing chords in the CAGED system relies on this principle, that you can take an open chord shape and then put a bar somewhere and reuse that open chord shape. So I can reuse my C shape anywhere on the guitar's neck. Or I could take my A shape, bung a bar on, which replaces the nut effectively, and I can move that A shape around, and it'll always sound pretty good. The fact that it's called CAGED is not just a coincidence. There are obviously those 5 letters, but we haven't put them in that order because it makes a good word. This order of letters, C, A, G, E, and D, is actually the order that the shapes appear on the fretboard. So if I take a C chord, I can play a C chord in lots of places on the guitar's neck. How to figure out where to play those chords? To begin with, you know that they're always going to follow a sequence that spells the word CAGED. So the first C chord on the guitar's neck is a C shape. That means the next shape on the guitar's neck is going to be an A shape, which is here. The next letter in the word CAGED is G, so the next shape on the guitar's neck, wherever that would be, has to be a G shape. Nobody plays the G shape because it's really awful. The next letter in the word CAGED is E, so the next shape on the guitar's fretboard to play a C chord has to be an E shape. And finally, the letter D, which is here, there's our final shape. And they're always going to follow that order, and when we get back round to our D chord, the next letter is going to be C, so we can now use our C shape again. And I can just keep going, I can keep cycling through those letters in that order. C, A, G, E, D, C, A, G, E, D. And the order that the chord shapes take always follows that pattern moving up the fretboard. This is true for all your open chords. So I could do it with a G chord. There's our G chord. It's the first shape on the guitar. It is the G shape. The next letter in the word CAGED is E. So the next G chord up the fretboard is going to be an E shape. Now we get a D shape because that's the next letter up the guitar. That's the next letter in the word CAGED. So I find my D shape. The next G chord is going to have to be a C shape because that's the next letter in the word CAGED. So our C shape is going to be here. And then the next letter in the word CAGED is A, so our A shape is going to be here. And then our final, we're back to our G shape again. We're back round to the front of the word CAGED. Obviously we're not at the front of the word CAGED, but The lettering always moves in that cycle, and that applies for every single open chord that you know. Those 5 shapes, C, A, G, E, and D, will always run up the fretboard in that order. So now you know the order that the shapes appear in. That's great, but it's pretty useless if you don't actually know where to put them. So how did I know where to place each shape as I moved up the fretboard? Let's talk about that. When you navigate by map in the real world, you use landmarks to orientate yourself. It's exactly the same in the CAGED system. There are landmarks all the way up this fretboard that I can use to figure out where to play these shapes. What are those landmarks? The landmarks that you use are the notes on the fretboard. This really means you have to know the notes on the lowest 3 strings of the guitar, know the notes at each fret, which is obviously not the most exciting task in the world, but it is extremely useful because each note only appears once on each string between the nut and the 12th fret. So if we take the note G, for example, the note G on the low E string only appears at the 3rd fret. That is the only G between the nut and the 12th fret. Similarly, on the A string, the only G that is on the A string between the nut and the 12th fret is at fret 10. And on the D string, there is a G at fret 5 of the D string. And that's the only G on that string. These landmarks only appear once on each string, and when you know where the landmark is, that is how you can figure out where to place each chord shape. What you have to do is you match the root note from the chord shape to the landmark on the fretboard. So if you take a C chord, for example, the C chord has a root note in it, the note is C, and the note C, that is the root note of our C shape, sits under my 3rd finger. Wherever I place this shape on the fretboard now, if I play the C shape here, the root note is still under this finger. So I know that this is now an F chord because the root note F is under my 3rd finger. I've used the landmark to position myself. Similarly, in, say, a G chord, the root note is under my 3rd finger again, coincidentally, but there's my root note on the low E string. That is the G that the G chord in a G shape forms itself off of in this case. In our A chord, in our A shape, the root note is the open A string. If it was done with a bar, the root note would be under my finger, that is the bar. If you don't know where the root notes in your open chords are, that's fine. Check out the lesson pack in the description. This week's lesson pack is totally free, so you can go to my website using the link in the description, download all the PDFs for this lesson, and then you'll be able to start mapping the fretboard using the CAGED system a little bit easier, regardless of where you are in your current knowledge of the fretboard already. Let's start mapping the CAGED system out using our open chords. So the first one we're going to do is we're going to use a C chord because it follows the word CAGED really nicely, and it's usually a good one to get started with if you're a total beginner because it's the most obvious in some sense. So what we do is we figure out where our first C note on the guitar is. This is our first landmark. So we have to look on the fretboard and we go, okay, where is the first C? The first C on the fretboard when you move from the nut down is at the 3rd fret on the A string. There's our C note. Now we need a piece of information. What is the first shape that we can play? Well, on the A string, we can form a shape towards the headstock, or we can form a shape towards the body. So the shape that goes towards the headstock on the A string is always a C shape. So there's the first letter in our word CAGED. We take our landmark that is on the A string, the note C, we build a shape towards the headstock. The shape that comes off the landmark on the A string towards the headstock is a C shape. From that same landmark, I could also build a shape moving towards the body. We could figure out what that shape is based on the word CAGED. The next letter in the word CAGED is A. So from this landmark on the A string, the other shape I can build that moves towards the body is an A shape. From a landmark on the A string, regardless of where you place that landmark, the shape that moves towards the headstock is always a C shape, and the shape that moves towards the body is always an A shape. Shape towards the headstock, shape towards the body. There's our first 2 letters out of the word CAGED. Let's find the next C on our guitar. So we keep moving up the fretboard till we get to fret 8. This is the next C on the guitar, on the lowest 3 strings. It is fret 8 of the low E string. In the same way that a landmark on the A string has a shape towards the headstock and a shape towards the body, so too does a landmark on the low E string. There's a shape that moves towards the headstock and a shape that moves towards the body. Our previous shape was the A shape. This means our next shape has to be a G shape. So from the landmark on the low E string, the shape that moves towards the headstock has to be a G shape because that is the next letter in the word caged. There's also going to be a shape that moves towards the body of the guitar. The next letter in the word caged is E. So from our landmark on the low E string, our next shape has to be an E shape moving towards the body. From any landmark on the low E string, the shape that moves towards the headstock is a G shape, and the shape that moves towards the body is an E shape. So now we have 4 C chords, right? We have our C chords based on the A string. We have our C shape towards the headstock from the A string, and our A shape, still a C chord, moving towards the body from its landmark on the A string. And likewise, we have our landmark on the low E string. The shape that moves towards the headstock is a G shape, and the shape that moves towards the body is an E shape. This only leaves the D shape, right? So we've had C, A, G, and E, and D. Where is our D shape going to be? Conveniently, the D shape is always rooted off of the D string, so I need to just find my C on the D string, it's at fret 10. And from that, I can then play my D chord, my D shape. It's a C chord in a D shape. There is actually a shape moving towards the headstock from this direction, but it's the E shape that was rooted on the low E string. So you can conceptualize it moving in either direction on the D string if you like, but I prefer to have the E shape be part of my root on the E string. Hopefully you can see that every landmark on the fretboard has a shape that moves towards the headstock and a shape that moves towards the body. The order of these shapes is always C, A, G, E, and D. On the A string, any landmark on this A string has 2 shapes that are neighbours of one another, the C shape going towards the headstock and the A shape moving towards the body. A landmark on the low E string has 2 neighbouring shapes, the G shape moving towards the headstock and the E shape moving towards the body. And then a landmark on the D string has 2 neighbouring shapes, the E shape moving towards the headstock and the D shape moving towards the body. This pattern works for every open chord shape that you have and works every landmark on the fretboard. To reinforce this point, let's do it with a G chord as well. So we find our first G on the fretboard, it's at fret 3 on the low E string. This means that if we have a landmark on the low E string, our shape moving towards the headstock must be a G shape. There's our first G chord. And our shape moving towards the body must be an E shape. Great, we've got our first 2 G chords on the fretboard using the CAGED system. Let's find our next G on the fretboard. We carry on moving up. The next G on the fretboard is on the D string at fret 5. This means we must have an E shape moving towards the headstock and a D shape moving towards the body. And our final landmark of G on the fretboard is at fret 10 on the A string. The 2 neighbouring shapes on the A string are the C shape and the A shape. The C shape moves towards the headstock up here, and the A shape moves towards the body. This is true wherever you place your landmark. So if I said I wanted to play, let's say I wanted to play an A chord here, the D string at fret 7, well, I could use a D shape moving towards the body, or I could use an E shape moving towards the headstock. This pattern of shapes is always the same. All that you do is change the landmark that you're playing off of. Let's talk about how to apply this idea more broadly. So now, hopefully you can start figuring out how to map your open major chord shapes all the way across the fretboard. You can obviously do this with major chords, but actually you could do this with any chord type, for example, minor chords. There are 5 open minor chords shapes. 2 of them are kind of brutal to play and most people would ignore them, but they still follow the same sequence and the same lettering. For example, there's a C minor shape that looks a bit like this. There's an A minor shape, which you should be familiar with. There is a G minor shape, which really nobody plays. There's an E minor shape, and there's a D minor shape. There are 5 shapes and they follow the same order and neighbouring positions on their landmarks as the major shapes. So if we picked a landmark, maybe we pick the note D, we're going to play a D minor chord from our first D on the fretboard. We could do the open D string if you like, but maybe we'll do that at the 12th fret. So we take the D on the A string, so we have to have a C minor shape moving towards the headstock because it's the A string. So our C minor shape is going to be absolutely awful to play, but it's something like this. There you go. And then we have our A minor shape moving towards the body. And then we find our next D. Our next D is at fret 10 on the low E string. So we have to have a G minor shape moving towards the headstock. And then we have to have our E minor shape moving towards the body. And then we get to our next D, which is fret 12, sorry, of the D string. Could use our D minor shape moving towards the body. And if you like, you could think of it as your E minor shape moving towards the headstock. See how those neighbor shapes are always the same? As long as you can find your landmark and you know which shape moves towards the headstock and which shape moves towards the body, you can figure out what chord shape you need to play and where. We could try this with an E7 chord. Maybe you want to play your E7 chord somewhere new. Well, there's an E at fret 7 on the A string. Maybe I could use a C7 shape there. The reason it's a C shape is because my root is on the A string and I'm moving towards the headstock, so it has to be a C shape, and then I kind of expand my C shape to become C7 by adding my little finger in. Or I could use my A shape moving towards the body, right? My A7 shape. Now I've got two new places that I could play an E7 chord just by virtue of the fact that I know where my landmark is and I know which shape to move based on which direction I'm heading in. So now you understand how the CAGED system works for mapping out chords. Let's try mapping some scales instead. Let's start with the minor pentatonic scale, seeing as hopefully you're already a little bit familiar with the shapes that exist in this scale. Let's say we wanted to play the A minor pentatonic scale. Well, we know that the 5th fret on the low E string is an A. And we know some chord shapes now that would work here. So for example, I know that from this shape, I could build an A minor chord using an E minor shape going towards the body. From this same landmark, I can build a minor pentatonic scale that moves in the same direction. There is a shape for the minor pentatonic scale that goes from the landmark on the low E string towards the body. It overlaps the notes in our E minor shape. Since the notes in that minor pentatonic scale shape overlap the notes that in the A minor chord that uses the E minor shape, I would call that shape for the minor pentatonic scale the E minor shape, seeing as it overlaps the E minor shape for the A minor chord. This phenomena is true for every shape in the CAGED system. So there's a minor pentatonic scale shape that overlaps the notes in a C minor shape. There's a shape that overlaps the notes in an A minor shape. There's a shape that overlaps the notes in a D minor shape, and so on. There's 5 shapes for the minor pentatonic scale, just as there are 5 shapes for our minor chords. Let's take that same landmark, and instead of building our minor pentatonic scale towards the body, let's build it going towards the headstock instead. It's still a minor pentatonic scale rooted on the note A, so it's still the A minor pentatonic scale, but now it overlaps our G minor shape because from our root on the low E string, the shape that moves towards the headstock is the G minor shape, so this must be the G minor shape of the minor pentatonic scale. Notice that even though this note on the 3rd fret of the low E string is included in the shape, I didn't start and finish there. And that's because I want to start and finish from the root of my scale, because that's the landmark. That's how I'm figuring out where to play and what shape I should be using. So when you start mapping out scales and arpeggios, you should start from the root note and finish on the root note, because you need to associate the shape with the landmark. That's what's going to help you navigate when you start moving between these shapes and moving across the whole fretboard. You need to be able to see where all your landmarks are. You don't want to associate the shape with this note here because that's not an A. So if I want to play my A minor pentatonic scale, I don't want to be thinking of a G note. I want to be thinking of an A note, and then what shape do I use relative to that A note? In which direction am I traveling? So from this landmark on the low E string at the 5th fret, I could use my G minor shape towards the headstock, or I could use my E minor shape for the minor pentatonic scale towards the body. If I go to another A, I could go to this A here. I can use my D minor shape towards the body, or I could use my E minor shape moving towards the headstock. You need to associate the shape and the landmark together. That's what's going to help you navigate across the fretboard. You can do the same thing for major pentatonic scales, so I can take the same landmark, A, but I can play a major pentatonic scale shape from it. The notes in that shape overlay our E shape that is coming off of the A on the low E string. So remember, we've got our root on the low E string, the shape that moves towards the body is an E shape. This is the E shape of the major pentatonic scale. Likewise, I can build a shape going towards the headstock. So what letter comes before E in the word caged? Well, it's G. So I could build a major pentatonic scale using the G shape moving towards the headstock. You astute viewers may have noticed that that looked an awful lot like the E minor shape for the minor pentatonic scale that I played a second ago. Well, the G shape of the major pentatonic scale and the E minor shape of the minor pentatonic scale have the same map, but they are not the same scale. So despite the fact that you might have heard you could take a minor pentatonic scale, move it back 3 frets, and now you've got the major pentatonic scale. It kind of is true, but that's certainly not how experienced players are thinking about it, because the root note has changed. In my minor pentatonic scale, my root note is under my first finger. That's where my landmark is. But in my major pentatonic scale shape, my root is under my little finger. And that influences what I play and how I choose to play it, because the root note has changed location. Every caged pentatonic scale shape has a relative minor shape that's associated with it. So the E minor shape for the minor pentatonic scale and the G shape for the major pentatonic scale are the same shape, but they are functionally different and they are musically different as well. Therefore, despite the overlap between the shapes, I still have them memorized as different things because I'm going to use them in different contexts and in different circumstances. And as I said a minute ago, the root has changed position, and therefore, because the root is in a different location, it is sensible to memorize these things as different shapes, despite the similarities. What you'll find is once you know one pentatonic scale, be that, say, you learned all the caged shapes for the minor pentatonic scale, you will memorize the major pentatonic scale shapes very quickly because they are, exactly the same 5 shapes. The only new piece of information you're adding essentially is where the root notes are, and therefore you'll memorize them a lot quicker. I want to reinforce how aware I am of where the root note is in each of these shapes. It is this landmark that is informing me of what to play, whether it is a chord or an arpeggio or a scale. I know that from this landmark, I can do an E shape towards the body, and then I have an E shape for the major pentatonic scale memorized, an E shape for the minor pentatonic scale memorized, an E major 7 shaped arpeggio memorized, an E dominant 7 shaped arpeggio memorized. Every sound that I want to create has an E shape, in this case, associated with it. Likewise, if I'm going towards the headstock, I have a G shape memorized for all of those things, the major pentatonic scale, the minor pentatonic scale, the Dorian mode, whatever it ends up being. The landmark is the most important thing. Once you have the landmark, you just need to learn the shapes that are associated with the landmark in the direction of the body and in the direction of the headstock. You can augment what you're memorizing by associating the shape with the following. 1. Where is the landmark? Is it on the E string, the A string, or the D string? 2. What shape am I using and which direction am I heading in? So is it the C shape towards the headstock or the A shape towards the body? 3, the finger that is in control of the landmark. So for example, in the E shape of the major pentatonic scale, my middle finger is in control of the landmark, but in the G shape of the major pentatonic scale, my little finger is in control of the landmark. So you should associate which finger is in control of the landmark for the shape that you're using. And 4, the underlying chord shape that the name is derived from. So is this using a C chord shape or is this using an A chord shape? But what open chord shape am I using to map my scale or arpeggio against? Here's a great exercise for developing your fretboard map. What we're going to do is we're going to map our open chords across the fretboard. Do this exercise in the key of C first, and then you should try it in other keys to consolidate your understanding. So the first step of the exercise is to find all the C's on the lowest 3 strings. So you need to find the C that's on the A string, the C that's on the low E string, and the C that's on the D string. Then, from each of those landmarks, you need to play the associated open chord shapes. So your first C on the fretboard, on the A string, you need to use the C shape going towards the headstock. And then from that same mark, you need to use the A shape going towards the body. From your next landmark, you do your G shape towards the headstock, and then your E shape towards the body. And then from the next landmark, you can do your D shape towards the body, and your E shape towards the headstock. You then just repeat this process moving around the fretboard. So you go back to one of the landmarks you previously used and you play both shapes from that landmark. So we're moving it through our C shapes. So I've got my C here, I'm going to do my G shape, and then there. And then I've got my C here, so I'll use a C shape in this direction and an A shape in this direction. Find my next C, here's my D shape, and here's my E shape, and then maybe go back here. And I'm just taking those landmarks and I'm just moving between them basically so that I can see where each landmark goes and what each landmark does and which shape I use in each direction. Once you've done that for one key, do it with another key. So do it with a G chord or do it with a B flat chord. There's a challenge. Where's your B flats on the guitar? So here's a B flat, here's a B flat, and here's a B flat. So I could use an A shape from here, no space, my C shape, but I'll get it further up. Here's my next B flat, so I could use my G shape here, my E shape here. Here's my D shape for my B flat. Oops, that wasn't very good, was it? There you go, there's my B flat. There's a D shape, and there's my E shape again. And with my next B flat, my next B flat's here, so here's a C shape for that. And there's my A shape. And if you want to go a little bit further, you should obviously do this further up the fretboard. You know, go past fret 12 because the shapes remain the same. You just need to find your landmarks and then figure out which string it's on and which shape is moving in which direction. That's the CAGED system in action. Start small, just map out your major shapes first. When you're comfortable with those, do your minor chord shapes. Remember, in some sense, you're a cartographer and building a map takes a long time. So work slowly, do one thing at a time. Major shapes, minor pentatonic scale, major pentatonic scale. Then you could try expanding those scales out into the modes. You could try doing arpeggios after that. Once you've done this for maybe 3 or 4 types, so your major chords, your minor chords, and your 2 pentatonic scales, you'll probably have a very good understanding of how the CAGED system works, and mapping other things from that point will really just be modifying your understanding of the map that you already have already. As I said, the lesson pack for this lesson is totally free, so you can check out the link in the description. It has all the PDF shapes for the chords and the scales that we've talked about today. There's also a lot more exercises that you can use to start mapping out the CAGED system beyond just the major chords that we talked about at the end of the lesson. Thanks for watching the lesson. If you learned something new, make sure you leave the video a like and share the video with any guitar players that you think might find it helpful. If you've got any questions on this, leave them in the comments below, and I'll see you for our lesson next Saturday.